Well, I have another amazing featured guest for us today. We are going to talk to Dr. Lorenzo Neal, and we're talking on the topic of gun violence prevention and self differentiation. Dr. Lorenzo Neal is a pastor and an author, and he shares his story of losing his 25-year-old mother and 18-year-old nephew to gun violence and how he uses the emotional intelligence of self differentiation to help others improve their interpersonal relationships. So, after the introduction, I will introduce you to Dr. Lorenzo Neal. Welcome, Dr. Neal, to the Blueprint. I'm so glad to have you.
Good afternoon. I am honored to be a part of the show. Thank you so much for having me.
Now, I have to tell you, I had to look up self differentiation. Uh, there is no shame here. Gun violence prevention and self differentiation. Before we get there, can you share with us about losing your 25-year-old mother and your 18-year-old nephew to gun violence and how you even found yourself talking about this topic?
Well, yes, I don't mind sharing it at all. In 1980, in the summer of 1980, uh, in my hometown, Monroe, Louisiana, my mother, Sharon, who was 25 years old at the time, 4 boys, lost her life in an act of domestic violence that involved a gun. And we lost her, but we gained we gained a legacy from her. My brothers and I were raised by her parents, my maternal grandparents, as their own children. So for a long time, I grew up knowing that they were my parents as well as my grandparents. Her sisters, her siblings were my sisters as well as my aunts. So
Wow.
we had a wonderful relationship. Um, and for a number of years, we did not discuss her death or the mode of her death. When I asked when I asked if my mom was alive, she was dead. How she died, we just didn't tell. It was many years later that my family began to be open to the idea of sharing with us from their perspective, the entirety of her mode of death, how that impacted them. As a matter of fact, it was about 30 years before we even really openly discussed it. We mourned her, we lamented her, we talked about her in private, not in public. And
So you're saying now you all were alive when she passed away, but the family really didn't have a discussion as to the how until 30 years later.
well, yeah, I was 5 when she passed away, and of course, I have a, a, a memory of that
Yeah.
event, but the recollection isn't as pure as I would like, because I have different recollections of the actual event. In some moments I'm there witnessing it, in other moments I'm being snatched away. And her siblings have described it as that we were there, but we were not present, to witness, but we were there. So it's kind of, they were shield us
Yes.
with the language. You were there, but you weren't there. And over a period of time, we got to understand you and appreciate it. It did help. One of my siblings passed away. He was murdered in 2010, and it was just shy of the 30th anniversary of my mother's death, and kind of opened up the spring of emotions and all of that. And that's when they really began to be a little bit more open about how her death and the mode of her death, it really impacted them emotionally. And I had just published the first volume of my book, Breaching the Family, that detailed some. It's semi-autobiographical.
Yeah.
Autobiographical. It talks about that experience and what happened afterwards. After the funeral. And this is the thing. After the funeral, she's dead. Don't talk. It was decided. And so having her son go through that same mode of death, except it was not by gun violence, but it was still
Yes. A
a
traumatic
tragic
death. Yes.
death. Um, Brought our family together, the immediate family, where we were able now to fully discuss how her death really impacted them, because she still had siblings who were in high school when she died. She had, her parents were just, and I didn't realize they were just in their early 40s when she died. And the trauma, the Lord was gracious to my brothers and I. We were not emotionally impacted, nor did we negatively, uh, we negatively affected by it. So we grew up pretty normal. We didn't act out. We didn't have any, you know, think. Well, I take that back. I did have my two baby brothers did have one little moment, you know, and the sibling who passed away, we realized he was more impacted by it than anyone else. He unfortunately had indulged in drugs, and he was able to get out of that and get up back on his feet shortly before he lost his life. Um, and he was apparently the only one who was, exhibited some type of negative behavior, but he
Hmm.
his adulthood by the time he had done that. For
Yes.
for most of our childhood, pretty normal, pretty guarded, and no direct or indirect trauma that we were experiencing. And so we went through that process and learned about it, and we wrestled with it. Um, and in 2016, my oldest brothers, my mother's oldest son, his 18-year-old son was killed in an act of gun violence, and that has yet to be solved. It's still an unsolved murder. Um, by this time, I had begun advocating some gun legislation, proactive gun legislation, common sense gun legislation, with Every Town for Gun Safety and Month to Mind Action. I got involved really with sharing my message after the shooting at Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina, where a colleague, friend, and brother of mine, Reverend Pinckney, and 8 of his parishioners were killed in an act of violence, and some would even deem a hate crime. And my denomination, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, rallied behind the cause of gun violence prevention. And that's really how I got engaged. I didn't share publicly a lot about my mother, but that galvanized my efforts to share my story of having been personally impacted by gun violence, by a person who should not have had a weapon, and domestic violence, and the nature of how domestic violence can turn tragic. So, so that was the impetus for me beginning to share my story, even though I had already written about it. Um,
Yes.
it's one thing to write about it and people read it, but then it's another thing to really articulate that publicly, and to share it in a very vulnerable manner, where you bring up every time you share your story of how you've been impacted by trauma and violence. Anyway, it brings up those emotions, and so I had.
So has writing about it and being able to discuss it and doing your activism, has that helped heal? Has that helped your healing process?
Oh yeah, a little bit. Therapy helps quite a bit too.
Okay. Look, wait. And Dr. Neal, I think that's important. And you need to say that again, because in our community, in the Black community, therapy now, I'm grateful and excited that it's talked about more, but add that in, because you're also a man of the cloth. Let me add that as well. So you've got Jesus, you've got God, you've got Holy Spirit, but also the fact that you're sharing that therapy is helpful as well, I think is important for the viewers and the listeners to hear from someone like yourself, that it's okay to get help.
Yeah, and I'm a pastoral counselor. I've served in hospital chaplaincy, and working with those persons and going through that process myself has enabled me to be more vocal and intentional about promoting healthy, holistic mental and physical health. And we're starting to see more of that. And the GPP movement, the gun violence prevention movement, really is um, because when you think about mass shootings in America, that most times the person who would carry out those events were often described as having mental illness, and the narrative would always go around the need for mental illness, but most of those persons were not black. And when it came to us, that discussion was not there, and we have higher homicide rates in our communities, particularly black on black, and it's still the same trauma. And most times these are mass shootings that go unnoticed because it's not a large crowd, or it's non-melanated people for the most part. And so adding the mental health component into my advocacy as well as my pastoral ministry is helping myself and others be be intentionally holistically healthy.
Talk to us some more about the gun violence prevention program that you are leading and the movement. Talk to us about that movement.
Yes, I'm a part of Every Town for Gun Safety Survivor Network. um, every town was started by Mayor Mike Bloomberg, and it was started as mayors against gun violence, for mayors in major
I
cities.
remember that.
Yes,
Yes.
address the gun violence that was at that time really and get impacting their cities, and it broadened out to not just include mayors, but it broadened to bring in the perspective of those who have been directly impacted by gun violence.
Ah,
And so was birthed the Every Town for Gun Safety Survivor Network. And unfortunately, there are way too many persons in that network. It's nothing that anybody should aspire to be in. We are a group of a lot of mothers, a lot of fathers, sisters, brothers, husbands who have one common thread. We lost someone to gun violence.
yes.
And in most cases, it was preventable gun violence. It was,
Mm,
cases where, going back to domestic abuse, where those persons should not have had access to a gun, or persons who, like in my nephew, we believe that a person committing that act was an act of felon, should not have had a weapon.
right.
Or in the case of mass shooters, um, these persons may legally obtain a weapon. They can go through and pass all the background checks and get a weapon, but then they may have a deficiency in their mental intelligence and their mental emotional intelligence and well-being that may trigger them to commit acts of violence against others. And so we largely advocate for common sense gun legislation that would not hinder but help those persons who uh, could possibly lose their lives to gun. Now, being a gun owner myself, I'm
Yeah.
an advocate for the Second Amendment. I own my weapons. They're safe. They're
Mm,
here, and I don't want nobody taking my weapons from me. I don't want to take anyone's else, but I do believe that we can do better as a country to make sure that we have legislation that's positive and reinforcing for those of us who adhere to what we believe the Constitution gives us the right to do. At the same time, protecting the possibility of those who may lose their lives because we had the means of preventing and did not.
Yes.
Another organization is Moms Demand Action that was started in 2012 as a result of the Sandy Hook school
Yeah.
shooting. And Mrs. Shannon Watts started that organization that now is a national organization, all 50 states represented. And the sole purpose is to engage the communities in helping raise the voices of survivors like myself, as well as advocate and speak out against preventable gun violence. And we're glad right now that President Biden is instituting or is pushing for legislation to reflect. So over the last 6-7 years, there's been legislation here and a little bit here, a little bit there, and
Yes.
it does so much. The other reason I got involved is in 2016, right after the shooting at Mother Emanuel, and a couple of other church shootings.
Yes.
Mississippi State Legislature decided that they want to put forth an act that they called the Church Protection Act that would allow Mississippi is an open carry state like many southern states. So they were going to allow open carry in so many, well, concealed carry. And that's probably not even the best wording for it. But you'll be able to have a weapon in
Yeah.
church. And as a pastor, I was like, you know what? If there's any safe place, the safest place you should be is in the church.
Mm.
And I do, even though I'm a gun advocate, I'm a gun owner and advocate like that, I don't want somebody sitting in my church and I don't know they have a weapon. I just think I should know. And but the way they did it, they said, well, your church should have a well-trained security team. Well, we already had that.
Right. Right.
You know, we already had persons within the confine in our local
Yeah.
city who were designated for that purpose. And
Sure.
so the law was saying, well, now officially designate them. And but at the same time was saying the persons could come into the church or to a courthouse, and as long as their weapon was in a purse or in a holster. And
So that means that I could come into a church and have the gun in my purse and be fine.
yes, pretty much.
Mm.
So I advocated against that, and I was the only one doing it. It
Yeah.
passed, but it passed after I helped bring about the awareness that
Yeah.
they're about to pass this bill, and with the help of every town and persons like Congressman Lucy McBath, who at the time, Lucy McBath, her son Jordan was killed in a
Mm.
gas station because the guy who killed him said the music was too loud.
Yes.
She, along with others, came and helped us at least raise the awareness
Yes.
and got that. It still passed, and my church follows the laws, as
Yes. Yes.
but it was just terrible that such a thing and many other state legislatures passed similar bills. It is just sad that they felt the need to have to legislate that, and they did. Terrible.
It may not have been necessary if we followed the tenets of the law.
That's,
And so so then you take it to the next level with self-differentiation. Talk to us about that. Because when I looked that up, and I was like, very, very interesting. So, and I know a number of our viewers are gun owners. I myself have gone to gun training and at some point will own a firearm by choice. So talk to us about self-differentiation.
yeah, that throws everybody off. Covered that by chance. Again, because I had gone to therapy and in my doctoral research, part I my doctoral degree is in community counseling psychology with a pastoral emphasis, and I learned about uh, Murray Bowen's family systems theory for family counseling, and he has 8 concepts that's a part of that theory, and one of the concepts is differentiation of self. along with fusion with others and societal and emotional process. It's eight concepts as part of that theory. And differentiation of self fascinated me. The idea that an individual can be less emotionally reactive by simply being more emotionally intelligent, just fascinated me. And so, differentiation itself, in its essence, is an individual being able to recognize, process emotions as they come without negatively reacting. So I might be mad at you,
Yes.
and I can feel the emotion of anger, frustration, or any other emotion that's associated with that. And I can take a few moments to assess how that emotion is, where it's stemming from. You
Yeah.
know, it's stemming because is that do I have that emotion because I'm really mad at my mama? You know,
Got it.
am I really mad at my dad? It's a family
Yeah.
of thing. And basically, the way we Bowen's theory is the way we interacted through our family of origin, our immediate families, our mother, father, brothers, and sisters, that and grandparents. That
Yes.
translate over into our interpersonal relationships with others. So we kind of get to the root of like, okay, am I really mad at my spouse, or am I mad at my brother 20 years ago?
Yeah.
That emotion is, that's driving the emotion that I'm experiencing right now, and I'm taking out someone else.
Mm.
And so what I thought was fascinating is, as a pastor, is that I see this week after week in congregations with intermediate family, because my dissertation research focused on the connectional church, the church as a family unit.
In
But
which it is. Yes.
many churches is basically groups of families.
Yes.
And those groups of families come with varying means of interaction, various means of how they, want the church to function. And then pastor,
Mhm.
we thrown in the mix somewhere if we're not related. And so I just thought it was fascinating. So I included that element as part of my study and look into Black psychology, the Black psyche. How do we function communically as a Black, not just as Black church, but Black family origins
Yes.
units? And so when I realized that, I said, yeah, this is something I should explore and write about. And then I made it applicable in my own self.
Yes.
That worked good. I was able really to differentiate a lot of underpinning elements to my emotional dysfunction, erratic relationships, and things of that nature, or erratic relationship patterns. Let me
Yes.
specific. And because I was able to determine that and extract those and it's the way we do it is in real time. You can do this in real time and process it in real time. That leads you to, so now you're mad at your spouse and you're able to say, okay, I know what triggered this emotion. I know what is driving or what is fueling this emotion. So this is how I'm processing it and how I'm going to respond. Okay, I can say something bad. I can say something mean and nasty that would just drive the fire, or I can
Yeah.
take a few moments to process my emotions, take these deep breaths I might need to take before I respond, and then respond, and maybe uh, shift the dynamic of the emotions that we're both maybe experiencing in that moment.
But that's important and that's critical when you talk about. My thought was when I saw and looked up self differentiation and did some digging, I thought, now this is critically important when you talk about gun ownership.
Oh yeah,
Because knowing, what came to mind was, to thine own self be true. Knowing whether or not, just because I can pass a psychological evaluation, that doesn't mean that I should be a gun owner. Because if I don't know those triggers, if I don't know myself and wholly, right, and find myself in a predicament where conversation is the solution, But if it's a trigger, like you're saying, going back to family dynamics, and I'm not really mad at you, I'm mad at my mother, I'm mad at my brother, and then reaching for something to help in the argument,
Oh yeah.
which is how gun violence happens. You know, people pull the gun, and you know what they tell you. I don't know what they told you, but when I was coming up, they used to say, if you pull it, use it. You never pull the gun without using it. So I saw the self-differentiation as critical in determining whether or not me or anybody else should even be a gun owner.
Yeah, it's critical. And I have to catch myself because again, the gun is a very powerful weapon, and when you when you pair that with negative emotions, it can be dangerous. It's uh, shooting a firearm triggers the same brain,
Endorphins,
or
yes.
same thing. And when I go to the shooting range, I have to do a decompressing exercise,
Yes.
all built up, and and sometimes I have to do an activity that would make sure that I'm going to burn off that energy.
Yes, because it's exhilarating. The
It is.
gun range is that experience of shooting the gun is exhilarating. Seeing the targets and seeing how well you did is rewarding, right? Yeah, you see, I get excited, but I mean, it's incredible. But then the reverse is, I say to myself, I will never date a gun owner because I'm thinking, wow, if we get in an argument, is this person going to pull, a gun on me? So there's a level of fear and apprehension there also.
And that brings in a different conversation, because my mother lost her life in an act of domestic violence that involved a gun. It's very dear to my heart, and in my personal romantic relationships, uh, I am very intentional about how uh, I respond emotionally, because I know that could be triggering. It could. And I'm grateful that I haven't gone down that road, and I hope I never have to. But it can be very triggering knowing that I had a parent who lost
Yes,
their life that way. And if I am not emotionally intelligent and responsible regarding those emotions,
correct.
very likely be an offender in the same sense. You know, and instead of me being the victim, I then become the perpetrator. And and I'm not talking about me personally, but I'm just
Yes, yes, but this is real talk here. We're talking about because you talk about responsible gun ownership, and gun protection and the self-differentiation. So I think, and it's critical. Again, I think that it's important, and that's why I'm glad that you agreed to come onto the program, because I think people need to hear that. Right. And I'm in the Washington metropolitan area, and we have gun classes regularly that is well attended. And that's why they have them so often, because they fill up so quickly with men and women. And I just think to myself, Lord, have mercy. I hope people are doing a self check, the self differentiation to know whether or not they should take that gun ownership to the next level other than just taking the training. So
yeah, and that's a critical thing that I know a lot of gun ranges probably don't offer. They don't want to be seen as trying to be in folks' business.
correct.
But one part of gun ownership responsibility is that the persons, you know, who owns the weapons know that they should only be willing to use them when they absolutely have to use them, and they should be secure enough so that child cannot access them.
Yes.
There's an unintentional shooting, and we've had that cross a number of times, and that's the critical element about being a responsible gun owner, knowing that you're going to be able to have the emotional intelligence to weigh and assess situations and go after. I'll give you an example, and this is not a great example, but the case of Breonna Taylor and all that happened there. Well, as more information about the narrative got out, we learned that her boyfriend was acting in what he believed to have been self-defense.
Yes.
He had his weapon. He
Yes.
legal gun owner, and he was like, I was acting in the greater
Yes.
benevolence of both of us.
Yes.
And in moments like that, nobody wants to be accountable.
Right.
He was trying to be accountable as best, at least the narrative he was
Yes.
promoting. And so it seems like uh, that that we have to take an assessment as individuals who may own weapons. We have weapons around our children and family members. And if you live in the hood like I do, and you hear gunshots just go off in the middle of the day for no reason, and you're thinking, okay, I better be ready.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
But yeah.
Armed with more than just the Bible. I understand.
Yes. Like what the character Medea say? I got my peace.
PEACE and PIECE. Yes.
Thank you, Tyler Perry, for that clarification.
Thank you so much, Dr. Neal, for joining me today and talking about the gun violence prevention and self-differentiation. I so appreciate your time, and I want everybody to see, please go visit his website and get his book and connect. I'm sorry?
Please buy the book.
Yes, please, please. Look, that not only supports him, it supports the ministry, it supports the cause, which is very important. And we want to do that and reach out to him to even talk to your organizations and your groups of individuals about gun prevention and gun violence prevention and self-differentiation. I think this is amazing. So I look forward to connecting with you, because maybe I can somehow figure out how to bring you to Washington to talk about that in my social groups for those so interested in gun ownership.
I'd be honored.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So this was amazing, wasn't it? Dr. Neal brought us such great information on gun violence prevention and self-differentiation. Another episode, another great information to help us design our life's vision and goal, one episode at a time. So I look forward to seeing you next week as I bring to you another amazing guest on the Blueprint.